Scary Scotland podcast, Episode 1, Food for Thought. It's a bitter winter's night, and on a lonely track on Scotland's west coast, a solitary traveller on horseback pulls his cloak more tightly around his shoulders in an attempt to keep out the sting of the rain and the relentless biting cold. It makes no difference. Despite his efforts, the cold still cuts through the man's cloak to his flesh and bones beneath. On one side of the track is the North Sea, where tumbling and crashing waves are creeping ever closer to the land. On the other side of the track are steep rocky cliffs, scarred with tall crevices and deep caves. As the wind blows across the vast openings, it makes a sound like a monster howling. But the traveller knows that's all it is, just sound, so he's not scared, at least not yet. Earlier that morning, the man had reluctantly left the warmth of his snug inn with a crackling fire in Stranraer. He stepped out into the cold fog, then saddled up his restless horse in the hope of covering the 50 miles north and reaching the town of Ayr by nightfall. With his occupation being that of a merchant, the man had been planning to sell fine Irish lace to some of the more affluent ladies of the area. He knew from experience that arriving by night would mean he could grab a good spot at dawn for the town's weekly market, and a good pitch made healthy sales much more likely. Unfortunately, the wind and rain had conspired against him, and now his horse was struggling to carry the traveller and his bundled possessions. Without warning, an audible ripping sound slices through the damp air. The merchant curses aloud as he realises that the rocking motion and weight of the rainwater means one of his bundles has worked loose from where it had been fastened to the saddle. He pulls on the reins to stop the exhausted horse. It is happy to oblige and hangs its head, its steamy breath merging into the cold, damp air. The merchant gets unsteadily down from the horse, then unties his faithful oil lantern from where it was fastened. Then, after struggling to shield his flint against the weather, he lights the lantern. In the soft glow, he begins to work on the knotted ropes of the dangling bundle of fabric with his raw fingers. After reattaching the damp material, the merchant begins preparing to reattach the lantern. He is just about to extinguish the flame when he hears a strange sound emanating from the darkness. The ungodly noise reminds him of the screeching of animals from the woods that had often frightened him as a child. Instead of turning down the lantern, the merchant reaches slowly into the folds of his cloak and pulls out a dented flintlock musket. It can only fire a single shot, but that's enough to even repel the bravest of wild creatures. He holds up his lantern and the musket and calls out to the darkness. There's another screech, closer this time. This startles the merchant. He fires the gun into the darkness, and the flash illuminates the area around the traveller for only a second, but just long enough to reveal 7 human-like creatures surrounding the man. With trembling fingers, the merchant grips the brass dial of the lantern and turns the flame up. As the rain batters down, the ragged figures begin to move closer to the merchant. Their wild, sunken eyes are locked on him with an expression of what the man initially believes might be fear or perhaps curiosity. But then, as they step closer, and he sees the saliva trickling down their leathery chins, the merchant realises in horror that their expression is that of hunger. Something heavy hits the back of the traveller's head, and the world slips away. As the unconscious merchant is dragged to the cave by his feet, those waiting are already making preparations. My name is Norman Brown, and you're listening to the Scary Scotland podcast, where we delve into the dark corners of Scottish legends to make connections with the wider world and culture. Tonight, we travel to ancient Scotland, where rumours about a Cannibal Clan originated and have been whispered down through the centuries. These dark, and if you'll pardon the expression, delicious tales have been woven into the fabric of Scottish folklore and have gone on to inspire countless books, movies and television shows. So in this episode, we're exploring the legend and legacy of Sawney Bean and his Cannibal Clan to consider why this particular legend has endured for so long. According to the many accounts of his murderous exploits, Alexander Sawney Bean was born in Ayrshire, Scotland, sometime between 1500 and 1600. It's difficult to pinpoint an exact date, because as you'll come to understand, this son of a ditch digger lived somewhat off the grid. Whether this was intentional or circumstantial, we may never know. However, we do know that at some point, as a young man, he met and married a dubious local woman known as Agnes Black Douglas. And we can conclude that they must have struggled financially, because eventually, Bean and his wife Agnes Douglas set up home in a large sea cave off the southwest coast of Scotland. Yes, you heard correct. They set up home in a cave. According to the legend, this cave, which curious tourists can still visit today, was hidden during high tide, a feature which aided the couple in their crimes which involved murdering over 1,000 victims across a 25-year reign of terror. Despite the fact that human remains would regularly wash up on the nearby beaches, the Bean family business was only discovered when the clan attacked a man and his wife one evening, pulling the latter from her horse. The husband desperately escaped and raised the alarm with a group of men who were returning from a local fair. Eventually, talk of the attack spread, and the distraught husband led a large posse of the king's men back to the location at which he was attacked. And there, they discovered the eviscerated body of his wife, as well as a cave full of bedraggled savages and countless pieces of half-eaten and even pickled human remains. In total, 48 members of the Bean clan were arrested and sentenced to death by hanging and burning for their grisly crimes. This would make it the largest mass execution in Scottish history. So far, so horrific. But as I said, Scottish history is peppered with bloody murders. So why would this particular legend have such a powerful grip on the public imagination? Well, the answer lies in what the Bean clan did with their murder victims. As well as robbing them, they supposedly ate them. Mention the word cannibalism to almost anybody, and they will most likely recoil, at least a little. It remains one of the last taboos. The idea that a person can look upon their fellow human as little more than food is both shocking and repulsive. And yet, or perhaps because of this, there has always been a surprisingly healthy, for want of a better word, appetite for such tales. Ancient Greek mythology is littered with gnawed bones of those individuals consumed by others. Oftentimes, the purpose behind this form of cannibalism will be to achieve some goal other than simply satisfying hunger. For example, according to the accounts of Kronos, the first of the Titans and father of Zeus, he ate all of Zeus's brothers and sisters at birth in an act of self-defense against a prophecy in which one of his children would overthrow him. Cronus had of course planned to eat Zeus too, thus completing his family feast. Fortunately for Zeus and his swallowed siblings, they were later freed from their intestinal prison when Kronos was tricked by Zeus's mother into swallowing a rock wrapped like a baby, which led him to regurgitate his entire surprisingly healthy prisoners back out. In other Greek legends, cannibalism is used as a means of revenge, such as that of Atreus, who after losing the throne to his brother Thyestes, entered a period of brooding anger. Eventually, having seemingly moved on from his sulk, Atreus invited his brother and his sons to a reconciliatory dinner. Just before the meal was served, Thyestes' son went missing. I'm sure that I don't need to tell you what he discovered when the metal lids covering the two dinner platters were lifted. But Greek legends are not the only ones to feature the horrendous idea of eating children. Take, for example, the child-eating monster of Slavic origins in the 18th century Baba Yaga. This was an old woman who dwelled in the forest and took great delight in frying and then gobbling up infants. At the same time, on the other side of the world, Japanese legends told of an alarmingly similar figure, known as the Yamamba, a mountain witch with a similar craving for human flesh. Over the years, as humans have become more enlightened, you may have expected this horrific figure would have simply crumbled into the dust of ancient history. But as we know, our deepest fears, and the stories we use to give them form, are difficult to shake off. The notion of the child eater from ancient legends hasn't gone away. It simply evolved into a wide range of incarnations, including the sly witch from the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, who gleefully enticed children into her candy-covered home, only to imprison them, with a plan to fatten them up before baking them in her oven and eating them. And that type of threat of being consumed is also evident in other fairy tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, where the murderous giant wants to make bread from Jack's ground up bones like some sort of artisan baker. Even within classic fiction novels such as Lord of the Flies and Heart of Darkness, it is clearly implied that humans, when stripped of the comfort of civilization, will ultimately descend into madness, savagery, and of course cannibalism. Having been left alone in the jungle too long, previously well-behaved and smartly dressed schoolboys or sensible company employees were soon feasting on flesh. And such stories mark an important step in our representation of evil, because suddenly the potential to carry out monstrous acts was not limited to supernatural creatures. And such stories mark an important step in our representation of evil, because suddenly the potential to carry out monstrous acts was not limited to supernatural creatures. But they were not excluded from the picnic either. For example, who can forget Stephen King's archetypal monster Pennywise the Clown, with his cavernous mouth of needle-sharp teeth stretched open like an overly excited Venus flytrap? Pennywise's first appearance in the opening of the novel involves him biting off a small boy's arm, then pulling him down through a sewer drain into the gurgling bowels of Derry, Maine. As the story develops, we begin to understand how feeding on others is what sustains the freakish fairground horror throughout his many centuries of life, a bit like enjoying a hearty lunch before going for a long nap. But we cannot consider the depiction of cannibalism in modern fiction without acknowledging the anti-hero of Thomas Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, Dr. Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter. Red Dragon introduced the character, but it was a sequel, The Silence of the Lambs, which thrust Dr. Lecter into the spotlight as a criminal and as a gastronomic genius who dispatches his own form of culinary justice upon the deviants he encounters. Devotees of the book and subsequent movie will possibly never look upon a tin of flava beans or a bottle of Chianti again without remembering how Hannibal Lecter gleefully describes particularly enjoying them served along with the pan-fried liver of one of his victims. But cannibalism as a theme is not limited to prose fiction. It's evident in the art world too. Fans of the Anglo-Irish punk band The Pogues will undoubtedly be familiar with the shocking painting which graces the cover of their 1985 album Rum, Sodomy and the Lash. The cover art is a reproduction of a painting entitled The Raft of the Medusa by the 19th century French artist Theodore Géricault. The painting depicts an infamous historical event in which almost 150 French sailors were stranded when their ship the Medusa ran aground on the scorching coast of West Africa. Realising that they had little chance of survival, the sailors made a decision they would almost certainly come to regret. They planned to head back out onto the ocean. 3 days later, 147 sailors cast off aboard a makeshift raft in the hope of encountering another ship. Their plans did eventually see fruition when, after spending almost 2 weeks at sea without food, water and exposed to the elements, the survivors were finally rescued. The journey, however, had not been kind to the sailors. Only 1 out of every 10 men survived. The rest had succumbed to starvation, disease and dehydration. Many had resorted to cannibalism simply in order to survive. Today, this formidable painting hangs proudly in one of the most famous art galleries in the world, the Louvre in Paris. It stands not only as a testament to the horrors endured by those unfortunate sailors, but also to the power such incidents can have in capturing the human imagination to the point of obsession. We see this in how it captivated the artist himself. As preparation for completion of his most controversial work, Géricault was fully immersed in and fascinated by the horrific incident. He met and interviewed survivors of the ill-fated ship for the purpose of conveying as much accuracy as possible. It's difficult to imagine whether or not they were compelled to describe the horrors they witnessed and endured as a form of catharsis, or if the artist needed to encourage them to cast their minds back to those endless days on that floating hell. In either case, these first-hand accounts allowed the artist to generate a bank of drawings and scale models of the raft. Géricault also spent countless hours visiting hospitals and morgues of Paris as a means of understanding the texture and tone of dying and dead skin. The figures depicted in the finished painting, which stands at 16 by 23 feet, are almost life-sized, and the realism of their diseased and lifeless bodies stands as testament to the artist's commitment to the subject. One can't help but wonder if the artist was ever tempted to take this research to the ultimate level by preparing some interesting snacks to sustain him as he painted. It might be equally tempting to believe that such tragedies as that which befell the Medusa could never happen in the modern world, but that assumption would be very wrong. A chillingly similar fate befell another group of travellers almost 2 centuries later, when pilot error meant that Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, carrying a rugby team, crashed into the Andes Mountains. As with the raft of the Medusa, the incident meant that a group of ill-prepared people were left exposed to the elements, only this time the location was a mountain at an elevation of almost 12,000 feet rather than a makeshift raft in the open sea. However, the tragic consequences were the same. After 2.5 months, only 14 of the 45 passengers and crew were found alive and rescued. All of them had only survived because, in the desperation and danger of their frozen location, in the absence of any other sources of food, they were forced to resort to cannibalism. In the intervening years, the traumatic experience of the survivors has been documented in numerous books, several documentaries and 3 full-length movies. It seems that when it comes to tales of cannibalism, we cannot consume, if you'll pardon the expression, enough of this stuff. And this should compel us to wonder why the fascination with this particular taboo. In future episodes we will explore lycanthropy as well as vampirism, both of which contains the element of consuming flesh and blood. So it may be that, like these legends, cannibalism is rooted in our fears, one of which may involve being reduced to nothing more than a source of nourishment for something or someone else. You see, for the most part, humans have been comfortable with eating other life forms for as long as we've been on the planet. It's considered by many to be natural, and reasserts man's place at the head of our biological table. But when we ourselves are the dish being served, the idea of eating living things takes on a very different light. If humans too can be reduced to a foodstuff, we might essentially be no different to all the other creatures we claim dominion over. So the true horror may not be about someone gnawing on our bones, but rather the existential implication that we are simply another animal. However, another aspect of cannibalism, especially when it's a product of desperation, might be the lingering question it poses for all of us. What would we do in similar circumstances to those who in desperation resorted to eating their fellow humans? If we too were trapped, isolated without food and with little chance of survival, and all around us were potential sources of nourishment, would we choose certain death over eating human flesh? It's a question that we hopefully never need to know the answer to. There is also a somewhat magical element to the idea of cannibalism. It features, even if just symbolically, in everything from voodoo to the Catholic Mass. Perhaps at some primal level, cannibalism is bound up with notions of transcendence and accessing the divine. So perhaps we view those who practice such an unusual and subversive act as attempting to become more than human, rather than less. This might explain the cultish fascination that many have with modern cannibals such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein. But what truth underpins the legend of Sawney Bean and his hungry brood? Well, firstly, it might be helpful to note that the origin of this particular legend was not in fact Scotland at all. It seems to have first appeared in an 18th century London-based publication entitled The Newgate Calendar. This English publication was a popular catalogue of crime in which events were sensationalised and most often exaggerated for effect and to boost sales. Some Scottish historians, such as Dr. Louise Yeoman, believe that the legend of Sawney Bean may have been deliberately created as a response to a historical event known as the Jacobite Risings of 1745. This was a period of political disruption during which groups of Scots had risen up and fought back against their London masters. At such times, stories about cannibal clans would serve a particular narrative. By representing certain Scots as murderous, incestuous savages, those in power could justify their own brutal actions and feed the public appetite. Dr. Yeoman notes that at the time Sawney was the name frequently attached to a derogatory cartoon Scot who was depicted in many London-based publications. Further doubt is cast on the factual origin of Sawney by the fact that prior to the account in the Newgate calendar, there was little evidence that he actually existed at all. Sawney might in fact be a hybrid of some other accounts of cannibalism, as well as vaguely recalled aspects of other Scottish figures. Scotland is a country with a rich and bloody history. Its rugged landscape has spawned countless tales of terrifying figures and mysterious murders. You only need to hear the names of places like Glencoe, Loch Ness or Edinburgh's Dungeon, and your mind will fill with murders, mysteries and horrors. Combine this with the fact that many of Scotland's real historical figures, such as William Wallace, Robert the Bruce and Rob Roy MacGregor, were fearsome figures, one of whom carried out raids, one who hid in a cave, and one who was an outlaw, and we may have some basic ingredients to throw into the cauldron to cook up this tasty story. But where did the cannibalistic element come from? Well, there are some cases of real cannibals in Scotland, and a few of their crimes bear more than a little resemblance to those attributed to Sawney Bean. Take, for example, Andrew Christie, sometimes referred to as Christie Cleek, a 15th century butcher who lived in Perthshire, Scotland. Nowadays, this lush green area of the country is known as the Garden Valley of Scotland because of the amount of food it produces, but back in the 15th century it was hit by a severe famine as well as a plague of rats. These two elements would have caused combined problems of hunger and disease. When these circumstances meant that Cleek could no longer earn a living, he joined a ragtag group of scavengers who roamed the country, preying on anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. At some point in their dark evolution, the group of marauders acquired a taste for human flesh, and so whenever they attacked and robbed a victim, Cleek, with his particular skill set, would butcher their victim. This status as a provider meant that he soon became the leader of the pack, who are believed to have slaughtered and eaten at least 30 victims. As for the name Christie Cleek, well, a cleek is an old Scots word for a hooked blade, which Andrew Christie used to kill and later suspend the carcasses of his victims. When we look back through the lens of history, it's easier to understand how these various elements, real crimes, political narratives, historical figures and deep-rooted fears can all be combined in one story. A legend so shocking that the public will gleefully feast on it for centuries. And so Sawney Bean and his Cannibal Clan might be exactly that, not so much a distinct truth in and of itself, but a concoction containing numerous ingredients, all bound up in a single digestible form, rather like that other Scottish delight, the haggis. But as always, every legend is associated with a place, and such geographical touchstones add a sense of authenticity. So, if you are ever in Scotland, and you get a chance to visit the south-west coast, you should certainly do so. Ayrshire has a rugged beauty, and no more so than along the water's edge. If you find yourself on the stretch of shoreline just south of the town of Lendlefoot, it is here that you might find a large tidal fissure known as Bennin Cave, or, as it has become known, Sawney Bean's Cave. As you approach the dark crevice, you may notice the seaweed and tide marks just below the entrance, meaning that the place will be hidden from the world when the tide is in. And if you are brave enough to step inside the cold shadows of this ancient cave, you will discover that it stretches back much further than you would have believed. The tall cavern seems large enough to serve as a natural and free shelter to a large number of people, and it's easy to imagine how on a cold and stormy night, being huddled in this cave with a crackling fire and blankets of furs might actually be rather homely, just as long as there was something good to eat. I'm Norman Brown, and this is the Scary Scotland podcast. Thank you for listening. Today's episode, Food for Thought, would not have been possible without historicuk.com, Scotland Off the Beaten Track, highlandtitles.com, thetakeout.com. Music is by PG Richmond of Creative Audio and Welcome No of Homemade Garbage Soundtracks. Thank you all.